prayers.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in the several offices through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest please to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
I have apologies for absence from Her Honor Senator Thompson, our Deputy President, who is away on business. Excuse as well from Senator Jerome Walcott, who is away on business. Senator Nurse and our chaplain will also be absent. An indication of lateness and arrival from Senator Tate.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions related to the business or citizens of the Senate moved by minister, introduction of bills.
Under comments.
Mr. President, I rise on this occasion to move the passing of a resolution in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Cap 228, the compulsory acquisition by the Government of Barbados of parcels of land situate at Kensington New Road and at Beccles Land, New Orleans, in St. Michael for the public purpose of housing developments.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 5. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Firearms Amendment Bill 2022.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I rise on the matter of the proposed amendments to the Firearms Act of Barbados. I rise to introduce this bill. There are a number of principal amendments that are being made to the bill, the first of which is an amendment to change the question of the sentencing requirements Then there is an element relating to the inclusion of sporting licenses. And then the third element relates to the provision of a regime for hunting licenses. And there are a number of elements captured within those three areas of the proposed amendment to the legislation. Now, Mr. President, in terms of the background and the context, we have an original Firearms Act, Cap 179, that dates back some time ago, initially 1896, and that act was then further amended and began in Cap 179 in November of 1998. That is the legislation, Mr. President, that we are now in 2022 seeking to make amendments to. Now, I begin my presentation today, Mr. President, by speaking to the context within which this is perhaps one of the most talked about topics in Barbados presently, because Mr. President, Barbadians every day are, whether on social media, in the press, on the call-in programs, in the rum shops, on the corners, and in their families, among their private conversations, having concerns legitimately raised about the use of firearms to commit crime in Barbados. We have seen, Mr. President, we all live in Barbados, and even though we travel in and out of the country from time to time, we keep abreast of the things that take place within our country, Mr. President. And what we have seen over the last few months, and certainly escalating over the last few weeks to some extent, is a slew of criminal activity taking place within a certain age group, affecting a certain number of our young males in principle, and affecting not just the families that are involved, both on the perpetrator's side, but the side of the victims as well, but then creating wide fear among Barbadians. And certainly, Mr. President, I was overseas on government business a few weeks ago, if it's so long, Mr. President, and to my horror, saw on the news that in a public service vehicle, a person was then shot in near proximity to other people going about their daily business. Now, that then brought what we have been seeing to an entirely new level, because let us be honest about this. A lot of times, people in their private conversations sometimes think, oh, that doesn't affect me, or that's happening only among certain people, or that is one group having a beef with another group, or that's not something that is happening in my neighborhood. But that the single mother on her way to take her child to school and having to take a public service vehicle and being in that vehicle potentially and then feeling unsafe because a person brazenly brandishes a weapon in a public space, not in the dead of night under cover of darkness, but in broad daylight early in the morning, in the middle of a highly trafficked intersection, is something that, of course, we as a government understand would create anxiety among a population. Now, a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Barbados announced at the culmination of the Barbados Labour Party annual conference in Queen's Park that there were going to be some changes that she would make. And one of those changes that she said she was going to be making was the appointment of a Minister of State in the Office of the Attorney General. There was widespread speculation at the time about whether or not this was a good move, if this was a good thing to do, who was he to be doing what he was doing, Mr. President, and what impacts could this possibly have on what we were seeing as a nation across this country. And this is before that shooting that I mentioned earlier took place in Eagle Hall. Now, Mr. President, if we were to listen to the debate in the public space, and we were to listen to the debate that took place in the other place when the Attorney General introduced this bill, We are very clear, Mr. President, that legislation such as this comes at the very end of a process that begins elsewhere. A piece of legislation and the amendments associated with this legislation, Mr. President, treats simply to what the state will do after the fact. After you have shot somebody, after you have killed somebody, after you have threatened somebody, after you have brandished a weapon. But this government is very clear that the only intervention cannot be a matter of legislation, because when the legislation kicks in, and by the time the Barbados Police Service kick in, it is, in many instances, after the fact. Perpetrators, by that time, are already perpetrators. Victims, by that time, are already victims. Family members who are dealing either with the loss of a family member who is a perpetrator or a family member who is a victim, because families are shattered by these things. These things are all after the fact. And so a prime minister who makes a determination that while on the one hand the state has to show that it is not just serious, but it is extremely serious about dealing with the things that happen after the fact, the state has to also go into preventative mode. And preventative mode does not involve only the legislation. It does not involve only the Barbados Police Service that does have a community and a family relations role to play, but it involves a whole of government approach, and it involves the provision of social services. And it is on that basis that the Prime Minister announced the appointment of a Minister of State, not in any of the other agencies, but embedded in the Office of the Attorney General, to work with the causal factors that lead to crime before the fact. To avoid having a scenario, Mr. President, where young men between an average of 18 and 25, and what's interesting about this, Mr. President, and I say interesting, but that really is not the right word. It's painful. Because I remember when my daughter was in secondary school, she's now 23 years old. When she was in secondary school, I remember at the time she was doing one of those SBA assignments for law. And she was fascinated by the fact that the men, the young faces on the pages of the crime reporting stories in the newspaper on a daily basis were not that much older than she was. They all looked like her in terms of age range. And she was fascinated by the idea that these young men in her age group, while she is in school and others like her are pursuing tertiary level education and planning for a future, you have young men who are throwing their future away and their families into disarray, and are appearing before a society, being paraded before the courts, charged with criminal offenses, in many instances with firearms. And we have seen that evolve over the years, where the average age of the person either involved in or a victim of the crime is in that young category, 18 and 25. You have had so many people talking about our youth are in crisis, our young men are in crisis. But yet when the Prime Minister, Mr. President, appoints someone to ensure that they are able to deal with the causal factors, then we are confused as to why we would do a thing like that and why we would place it within the Office of the Attorney General that deals with oftentimes what happens after the fact, when the law has to kick in, when the police have to kick in, when the penal system then is dealing with you and the judiciary is dealing with you to sentence you, to charge and sentence you for crimes which have been committed. What we are trying to do, Mr. President, is to take a Barbados-centered approach, a people-centered approach. And that is where I want to anchor my comments here today. Mr. President, I happen to have spoken on more than one occasion about the challenges of our education system. I have not been shy about saying, Mr. President, on more than one occasion that I am not a supporter of what we currently have. I have not been shy about saying, Mr. President, that I am a firm advocate for complete education sector reform, and I'm not talking about education sector reform only as it relates to the abolition or the retention of the common entrance system. I have been very, very clear on all occasions that I am a proponent of a complete reconstruction and deconstruction and reconstruction of the education system. I have not been shy about saying that. I have also not been shy about saying, Mr. President, that I believe that currently as constituted, our education system has served almost as a form of social sifting. I have said it before in this very chamber, where I believe that many people who are on an academic track, persons like many of us in this room, have the benefit and have benefited from our education system as structured, and those that are not do not have the benefit and are, in many instances, pushed to the side and are relegated to what we call, in many instances, whether anecdotally or otherwise, second-class citizens in our own country. I have not been shy about saying, Mr. President, and I say it here today without apology, that there are many young people who, at age 11, are told that they're simply not good enough. And many of those young people become 16-year-olds who feel discarded by a system, who feel as though they don't have an investment in a country that they feel has not served them well. Many of them become 18-year-olds who feel as though they have no investment in a country, and therefore these are the young people who feel that they have nothing to lose, Mr. President. These are the young people who are comfortable either taking a life or living a life that says either jail or dead, because we have allowed them from age 11, starting with our education system at the level of the state, to feel as though they do not have a stake in a community and in a country that should be embracing them. And so I make no apologies for saying, Mr. President, that a key plank of this government's approach to treating to the social issues that are creating an environment that enables young people to go down the wrong path is and must be complete education sector reform, and this government has been clear about that as well. So to say we're not doing anything is inaccurate, because that is a complaint. This is a component of that. There's a social sector component, Mr. President, where this administration also, and the Honourable Attorney General spoke about it in his presentation when he talked about the work being done at the community centres across the country, Mr. President, opening back up those community centres, ensuring that young people have safe spaces to go to and have activities in which to engage. Many of us, Mr. President, many of us know what it is to have to take children every evening to netball, to football, to tennis, to swimming, to dance, to some extracurricular activity after school, because we kept our children engaged and busy. But when you have children who are feeling internal to the school system discarded, they're not engaged in any meaningful activity out of the home environment, after school, they're not involved in football, there are no community centers for them to go to, their parents are working, and many of them from single-family homes, and so they don't have the disposable income to enroll them in some of the co-curricular activities that maybe a middle class or upper income, middle income home can afford to provide. Then you have a problem, Mr. President, because children, again, need an outlet. They need structure. So here we are now, Mr. President, with, at a state level, an education system in need of reform, a social care system that now is being resuscitated to embrace many of these people and to ensure that they have outlets for their energies and safe spaces in which they can express themselves and forge an identity that is productive and contributes positively to society. But you also have, Mr. President, and I grew up in a home where my mother worked in a secondary school in a rural community for all my life. And I'm sure that all of us have also grown up hearing stories of children who were discarded by the system and sent to schools because they only got 13 or 20 or something like that, and the system has decided you go there among those people. And then there are no co-curricular activities. Over the years, they have been introduced over many years, and lots of technical and vocational training introduced to allow people to express their skills and their competencies in a different way other than those which are academic. But, Mr. President, we all know of stories where many of these children come from homes where there are any number of socioeconomic challenges in the home in which they live and in the community where the home is located. They grow up every day listening to people having poor conflict resolution skills. They get up every morning to somebody screaming and hollering and cursing and carrying on, and they go home on evenings to just that, Mr. President. So they don't have the skills sometimes, Mr. President, to effectively resolve conflict. So you step on my foot, I already vexed. I left home vexed because they left home with somebody cursing and carrying on. When I got home, that's the first thing I heard. I unhappy because my mother ain't got enough money to send me to school, so I vex. I'm struggling already. I feel excluded. I feel as though I don't have a place in my community, and I'm not making a case for persons who are engaging in criminal activity, but I am saying that a state has to involve itself in both punitive measures while at the same time treating to the socioeconomic conditions that lead in some instances to the crime prevention strategies that we have to also employ at the same time. And that is where this administration is going, Mr. President, and that is a framing that I want to put around this firearms legislation. Now, Mr. President, I have heard in the course of the last 2 years, almost 3 years now, since I've been a member of this cabinet, the Prime Minister of Barbados speaking on more than one occasion about the importance of parenting skills. We have a number of parents who need assistance with parenting skills. We have a number of parents who would benefit from institutions that are doing important work, like Parados, like others, so that they have the skills. Because, Mr. President, we all know that many of our schools, many of our teachers, many of our principals find themselves in a situation where a parent of a child who is behaving problematically in a school environment is also often to be that parent who can turn up at the school and blind a teacher in curse for disciplining a child that is behaving badly. And oftentimes you will see that same child appear in a few years on your court pages, charged for a crime of some kind. Because one, they have learned problematic behavior. Two, they have been enabled by parents who support problematic behavior, and at the intervention of sometimes teachers and principals and guidance counselors who would wish to be able to help and who try their best oftentimes to help. It is oftentimes with the opposition of either a parent or a guardian who supports poor behavior. These are the kinds of things, Mr. President, that a crime prevention strategy is expected to address under a Minister of State in an Attorney General's office in collaboration with all of the apparatus of government across the various institutions. These are some of the things that we're dealing with, Mr. President. So I don't want to begin a discussion on the firearms legislation because there are those among us, certainly on our side, who are schooled in the matter of law, who will speak to those types of issues when they are intervening. But I wanted to frame our discussion around firearms and crime prevention, as well as the treatment of crime after its commission within that broad social context. I happen also, Mr. President, to have been the chairman of the Bridgetown Port when we procured scanners. I was in the Senate at the time, and I spoke about that at the time. I remember being brought maybe 6 weeks after assuming the role of chairman to a meeting of the National Security Council chaired by the Prime Minister. I had no knowledge of anything that went before me. I had just come. And I remember coming out of that meeting feeling as though I had chunks of flesh taken out of my back. I remember that meeting vividly because the Prime Minister and the members of the National Security Council at that time said in very clear English, "This is a problem. It must be fixed." And the Prime Minister, I remember she said to me, "I appointed you, I'm holding you responsible. So you have to be able to get it done." And so we went about the process of assessing what the problem was, identifying what the solutions needed to be because there was no single solution, identifying where to find the financial resources to be able to capitalize what needed to be done, and then implementing it. Barbados now, at our Bridgetown port, has the kind of screening apparatus that you have heard the Attorney General speak of. We typically do not speak in any great detail about what actually is there because that will be a national security matter. But suffice to say that what we came and found is most definitely not what is there now. In my most recent incarnation, I happened also then to be the minister with responsibility for the Grantley Adams International Airport. And so the airport on the one hand and the seaport on the other hand, I have had responsibility for both. And Mr. President, I want to make the connection in this instance sometimes between the ease of facilitation and the importance of national security and the importance of detection of contraband, including firearms at our borders, in particular in our ports of entry. The 2 ports of entry that I have been responsible for. Mr. President, on any given Thursday through Sunday afternoon, my phone would go ballistic. Every single week, my phone would go crazy. Somebody would be calling me, including some people who sit in this room, and they would be hollering for blue murder over how long it takes for bags to clear. And it was a nightmare. It really was. Sometimes you could not have bags clearing, depending on the flight in particular, for sometimes an hour. The senator of whom I'm speaking is looking at me with a straight face, but they know who I mean. It's a challenge. It's been a challenge. There's no question about it. And so between Thursday and Sunday, my phone would make me miserable, especially between 1:30 and 5:30 in the evening. Why, Mr. President? Because it is a port of entry. And I remember saying one day, I would be loath, because while it is the airport, you've always heard me say the airport is an ecosystem. And the Barbados Police Service and the Customs Department, which do not fall under the remit of the minister with responsibility for the airport, but fall under the national security apparatus, they have a responsibility for protecting the border. They didn't answer to me, and rightfully so. And on that basis, Mr. President, every single day, especially where they received intelligence from the partners with whom they collaborated regionally and internationally, the delays in facilitating the clearance of bags were directly linked to the importance of detecting contraband at the borders, being executed under the careful and the watchful eye of the Barbados Police Service, in particular in the lead with the drug squad, including with the dogs and the Customs Department. And there were not at times reasons for that to be so. And on the occasions where there were reasons for that to be so, it also resulted, therefore, in further delays in clearances of your bags. Because people try all kinds of things. People don't just bring them in at the Bridgetown port where there were scanners. People would try to bring them in at the Grantley Adams International Airport. And so the security mechanisms that this government has had to put in place in both ports of entry, it has been, those mechanisms have not been inexpensive. They have been significantly expensive to the government of Barbados, but they have been critical as part of the detection strategy and the protection of our borders, specifically the ports of entry, because we still live on an island, and let us not ignore the fact that there are beaches, some all around the island, and so they are also being policed by the Barbados Police Service. But certainly as it relates to our ports of entry, what needed to be done there was most definitely being done in those places, and I can say that without question. Those were critical things that the government of Barbados had to do, and those are things that we did do. And so here we are now in 2022 with a spate of firearm offenses, a number of persons who are committing these offenses, in some instances repeated offenses, with the use of a firearm, and the government has sought, in addition to all the other things that I have said the government is doing, crime prevention, social services, education reform, protection of our border, engagement, and I'm not speaking out of turn in this instance, I'm preempting the submission to Cabinet that the Minister of State in the Attorney General has made reference to, that he will be presenting to Cabinet imminently a comprehensive plan, so I will leave that to him and then to Cabinet thereafter to announce what that strategy contains. But there is a comprehensive approach that is being taken by this government to treat to the issue of crime and crime prevention, and then thereafter deterring people from committing crimes. Now, how are we looking to deter people from committing crimes as it relates to this legislation, Mr. President? That brings me then to the actual legislation itself. Mr. President, the first amendment that is being proposed under this amendment is the provision of mandatory minimum sentences. Now, one of the conversations that a lot of people have been having has been the question of what should be an appropriate sentence. And I'm always intrigued, as a non-lawyer myself, when I hear people in the public space commenting on the sentences being given by the judiciary. It's too long, he should have get 20 years, he should have get 50, he should have get this. But we don't make those decisions. Those things are based on the legislation and the parameters given to the judges. And so that is what we see. Now, it was in this Senate in 2018, there are a few of us who were here at the time, and we can recall having a meeting over on the other side, the West Wing, at the time, where the Attorney General, the Commissioner of Police, and the top brass of the Barbados Police Service, as it was then the Royal Barbados Police Force, received a comprehensive briefing on the recommendations that were being made as it related to, I believe it was the Bail Act, as it is now called, and then it was struck down by the courts. We saw in that briefing some of the challenges that the Barbados Police Service were dealing with. They shared for the first time some of the intelligence that was available to them, the kinds of weaponry that had been coming into the country, the kinds of activity that people had been engaged in. It was a combination of those of us who sat on this side representing the government of Barbados at the time, those who sat on the other side as the independent and as independent senators, and those who also sat as opposition senators. It was a comprehensive briefing that incorporated all of the members of this honorable chamber. Now, Mr. President, in 2018, we had a 30-love majority in the House of Assembly, and we did the same thing in 2022. But in 2018, we had an opposition leader, and we therefore had an opposition senator, and so all of the members of the other place, including the then leader of the opposition, benefited from a briefing, and here in the Senate, the senators appointed by the then leader of the opposition also benefited from that. We took then, as we do now, a whole of government approach, and we did a briefing, Mr. President. We also, on another occasion, had a piece of legislation relating to the mandatory imposition of the death penalty. And we also had a second session where, at the time, the Honourable Attorney General came and met with the members of this chamber to raise what the concerns were, or to hear what concerns were, and to raise the recommendations on behalf of the government. And at the time, what we were clear on in those pieces of legislation was that mandatory sentences, the mandatory nature of the sentence, which removed the discretion of the judge to make decisions within the confines of the legislation, but that were absolutely prescriptive, were not constitutional, and they had to be changed. And on that basis, Mr. President, we now have before us a mandatory minimum sentence proposal for amendment, which has been recommended by the Law Reform Commission of Barbados. And this particular body of work that is before you in the draft of the legislation is the work, and I would wish to credit the Law Reform Commission for having done this work and having taken a break from the other substantive body of significant work on which they are currently consulting. to be able to look at this piece of legislation given its critical importance to the people of Barbados. And so what you have here now is a piece of legislation that reflects that which has stood the test of time in other jurisdictions, which speaks to mandatory minimum sentences. So in this instance, a person, for example, who had a firearm in his possession or ammunition was liable to conviction on indictment of a fine of $100,000 or to imprisonment for a term of 20 years or both. What we have now in so doing, this amending act is repealing the previous alternative of a fine and then withdrawing the discussion to impose a custodial sentence of less than 7 years and 15 years for first and second or subsequent offenses as described, Mr. President. These are not measures that are unique in this case to Barbados. There are instances which are drawn based on what the Law Reform Commission has shared with us. In the United Kingdom, there is a Criminal Justice Act of 2003 where mandatory minimum sentences were imposed for 5 years for anyone convicted of the possession of prohibited weapons, including firearms. And so we have examples also from the UK and the Turks and Caicos Islands where these ordinances are included in their legislation. So we want to be able to ensure that we are engaging in this instance in deterrence. And I'm using that word for the first time. I've talked about prevention. I've talked about punishment. We talked about what happens punitively after the fact. And in this instance, what we are trying to do with this legislation is to ensure that there is a deterrent for people. Mr. President, the idea that people feel that jail is almost like a university. They feel that going up to Dodds is almost like they have arrived. They have graduated. The courts are going to be lenient. We can get up on bail just now. We can go up on remand, and in 2 minutes, we can be back out. You have people who are on bail for 3 and 4 different offenses, and they're coming back out, and they're recommitting, but there's no consequence. And so even when they finally are charged, Mr. President, the way in which the legislation at the time was drafted did not necessarily provide the kind of deterrent that this administration wants to ensure. And so on that basis, that is one of the elements that we are having here. I'm going to leave the attorneys in the chamber to speak to the specifics of those texts because I don't want to muddy the waters at all. But then I'm also going to go down to speak to the question further of deterrence, Mr. President, specifically as a social measure, because that is also one of the key things that this administration has been concerned about. Now, Mr. President, we have another element here in it as well, which relates to 2 components that were not previously there in the same way. We have a sporting firearm license and we have a hunting firearm license. Now, somebody may argue in some instances that if we're dealing with the issues of crime, why include these kinds of issues here now? Why not come back to it? Now, Mr. President, I don't have to in any way say to you how overburdened our legal system is in terms of legislative drafting. We have a limited number of persons who are responsible for legislative drafting. They are responsible for legislative drafting for the entire government. They are responsible for dealing with all of the urgent bills and pieces of legislation that will come from different places at different times. And sometimes it's urgent, sometimes it's massive pieces of legislation at different times. You have such an onerous responsibility being placed on the office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel and that small team, Mr. President, that anytime you are attempting to treat to drafting of legislation, it is being proposed that we try to be as comprehensive with a single piece of legislation as we can at the same time. And so on that basis, it made sense for the sporting firearm license regime and the hunting firearm licensing regime, both of which have been raised by the respective federations to be included in here. Now, for sporting firearm licensing, there are a number of persons who on an annual basis, we see footballers, we see track and fielders, we see the netballers who are traveling overseas all the time to compete regionally and internationally in sporting events. The same thing applies, Mr. President, to those persons who shoot for sport. And there are a number of associations and federations here, 3 of them in total, Mr. President, that provide the kind of training and competitive training for sport that is done on an international competitive level, and in some instances they have done quite well. And so the regime for sporting licenses is now included in here, Mr. President, and the same thing applies for hunting as well. Now, hunting is a different regime altogether, and the Barbados Police Service in particular has had some challenges navigating this. This is one of the areas that will be relevant in particular to those persons who are in the agriculture sector, who need to be able to ensure that they can responsibly take care of their crops from predators, not human predators in this instance, but from those predators that are taking, in some instances, 30% of every harvest from our farmers as a result of the challenges that they are facing. And so this regime attempts to responsibly treat to that. Now, Mr. President, there's only one other element in here that I want to make specific mention of, and it is an item that was raised by the Honourable Attorney General, specifically to a consequential amendment to the Juries Act. The Juries Act now allows for persons who are charged for murder to have a jury trial of 12 persons, but for people who are charged with firearm offences, the jury trial is 9 persons. This bill is going to lead to consequential amendments to the Juries Act as well, which now allows for 1, a person to be charged both for murder and for the possession of a firearm separately, and also to have those charges heard by a jury of 12 persons as opposed to 9. But those will be some of the things that I'm sure over the course of the discussion today and the debate from the various members and the issues that will be raised by the various members from the floor, that we will have an opportunity to revert to if there are any questions. So, Mr. President, this is, as I said before, the work of the Law Reform Commission. We expect that further work will be done. I am sure that there are honourable senators here who may have inputs and may have issues that they may want to raise. If so, we will be able to respond, and we will take careful note of what those things are, and we will take them from there, because, Mr. President, I want to end in my brief introduction of this bill where I started, by saying, Mr. President, that this must be a whole of government approach. This must treat to our education reform efforts. It must treat to our social reform efforts. It must treat to what happens in the family. It must treat to what happens in our communities. And I'm telling you, Mr. President, as well, that the day that Barbados becomes an informer type environment where it is a taboo to speak to the police and to share intelligence with the police with things that you have seen or you know have happened, Mr. President, that it will be a dark day in our history, because police have to be able to have the benefit of those who see something, who hear something, sharing their insights with them so that we can maintain the level of crime-solving percentages that Barbados has always been known for relative to many other countries in the region. Now, Mr. President, I want to close by saying this. We have seen a generation begin to glamorize the culture that sometimes you see elsewhere. It's good to be a bad man. And so you dress away, you walk away, you talk away, you live away, you got a lot of money and you're spending and you're dashing away everywhere, that kind of thing. That has been glamorized, Mr. President. But I want to say, Mr. President, at the same time, that if history, not just here in Barbados, but in other countries where we have seen this being perpetuated, is anything to go by, that only ends 2 ways: jail or death. And when we have families, young people, children growing up in this environment, and to see young children lamenting the loss of a family member, it is a painful thing. But we must also ensure, Mr. President, that what we are passing on to our children and our young people is generational wealth, generational excellence. We're passing on ambition and inspiration, but we are not passing on a glamorization of a subculture that can only lead to the detriment of our young people, Mr. President. That has to come with a change. And so this is the occasion where our communities, our families, our mothers in particular, as well as our fathers, our churches, our social groups, are all playing an active role in intervening at different stages in our community where we can see that it makes a difference. That will make the job of law enforcement after the fact so much easier if we were to engage first and foremost in prevention, Mr. President. And with these few words, I will have an opportunity in closing to respond more expansively to the issues that I am sure will be raised from the floor, and so I will take the time to be able to use it then. I am obliged to you, Mr. President. I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Speakers? If no speakers, then the question. Senator Dr. Heinz.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. I'm a little surprised that nobody wants to speak on this really critical topic and piece of legislation. So I'm going to start by and I thank you, Senator Cummins, for so well clarifying the objectives of this legislation. I made my own notes. I too am not an attorney, so I have to sit down and make my notes and try and translate this law talk into English, or that I can understand, because it is in English. And my summary notes that this bill adds categories, as you noted, sporting firearms license, a hunting firearms license, sections 13A and 13B. It also offers clarification by expanding regarding the surrender and revocation of firearms. It extends this to, of licenses rather, it extends this beyond licenses to licenses, firearms, and ammunition. So it is not just licenses that need to be surrendered or revoked in certain cases, but these other things. I also see the correction of a typo, which is included in section 15B. However, I hope that when we get to the committee stage, I can say something about this because the correction is unclear. It asks that a word be omitted from the last line, but that word is in the last line twice. So it needs to specify which of those needs to come out. I know which one, and it's the one that makes sense. However, as written, it is not clear. Let's put it that way. It deals with prosecution and punishment and sentencing, including both treating to mandatory sentencing, but also providing some flexibility so that a mandatory sentence does not necessarily have to apply. There are certain conditions if the person is under 18, if it is a first offense and is not a violent offense, and there are other mitigating circumstances that the judge can consider at sentencing. So although we see these increases in sentences for a first offense from between 7 to 15 years to 10 to 20, and then for a second offense from between 15 to 25 years to 20 years to life, there are these provisions that allow for some flexibility depending on the circumstance. And I think that this is quite useful as well. Before proceeding, I want to state very clearly that this is a very scary circumstance in Barbados that we are all experiencing. To be seeing gun crime in this way, to hear of an elderly gentleman found dead in his home, shot, someone who just survived a stroke, that is scary. To hear of persons who are just going about their business on the morning, going to school, to work, whatever it is they need to do, they're shopping, and they experience a shooting in a public service vehicle. This is frightening. And it's not just this year. This is something that has been going on. There is a case that I've been reading, following in the newspaper, relating to a shooting that occurred in a shopping mall a few years ago in Sheraton Center. And there were members of the blind community that testified. That also is quite shocking and startling. There are persons who, they're just enjoying themselves in the mall. They're doing their shopping, they're in the food court, children are there going to watch a movie and then relax after. These things are very unsettling, in particular for a small place such as Barbados. And it is important for us to be clear that we are not the worst. This is not the worst place in the region by any stretch of the imagination. And I guess we can take a little bit of comfort in that, but only a little. Only a little. I note, for instance, that in St. Lucia, so far for the year, they have had 49 such crimes as compared to our 39. We also had 49 in 2019. And we want to move away from this. This is not healthy for our country to be people living in this state of fear. And the question that the Honourable Prime Minister always asks, is this who we are? I do not think that this is who we are. And it is critical that we put in place measures to ensure that this is not who we become, that this is not normalized, that people do not become desensitized to these kinds of issues. And it is for this reason that I think I can understand, let me put it that way, the amendments in here that speak to sentencing and punishment. I can understand them. What is the purpose of sentencing? I did a little reading. The Sentencing Council in the UK notes that sentences are supposed to punish offenders, reduce crimes, so act as deterrents, reform or rehabilitate, and thereby prevent future offenses as recidivism, protect the public, and can also offer recompense. This is the role of sentences. And one of the critical things that I think this amendment does to respond to the current situation that we are in is impose harsher sentences. We are getting tough on crime. That is the language, right? And getting tough on crime should function as a deterrent. As Senator Cummins says, we have heard people across Barbados that say, put people in jail for longer, lost them way in jail. If you put these kinds of sentences in place, people will be deterred. They will not be bothered to be involved in gun crimes, in violent crimes, and so on. This is the popular sentiment. But my question is this true? Is this true? Is this sentiment alone, or is this based in evidence? Is this based in fact? Is it? Is there evidence that suggests that harsher sentences act as deterrents? Or are we responding as we should and as we must be serious about this situation? Are we responding to public sentiment and putting in place sentences to placate the public that may not indeed do what they're supposed to do? I do not have any issue with increasing these sentences. I don't have any issue because I too got kind of feeling of lock them up, right? But I am a person that I want things to be driven by evidence. So what is the evidence, and where is the evidence that suggests that this actually is going to address our problem? Do these sentences, after we start imposing these sentences, are we going to see a dramatic drop in gun-related crime? And I'm not suggesting that anyone is saying that these will be used in isolation. That is not my suggestion at all. And we know that there are initiatives in place. We've heard of Minister Corey Lane's role, what he will be doing, and I think that does address the other side. So stopping people from getting to the point where they need to be sentenced. In the debate in the other place, I also heard the Attorney General indicate that the intent is to stop people from getting here. We don't want them to get to this point. But when they get to this point, do these sentences make a difference? So I found some information. I want to know, is there evidence to suggest that this element is going to do anything? Who will it deter? Will it deter anyone at all? So I'll say what I found. Brian Lufkin, 2018, in an article called Criminal Myths, notes that there is little evidence to suggest that the threat of prison time deters ex-prisoners from crime. Many indeed discount the future and do not think they will be caught. That's one. The Justice Policy Institute notes that research has found that longer prison sentences do not deter future criminal offending. The evolving consensus in the field of criminal justice is that people are not deterred by severity of punishment or sentence length. But, and this is the one that I found interesting, but the certainty and swiftness of being caught and receiving a sentence. This speaks now to policing rather than sentencing. So the certainty that if you believe that you're going to get caught and that you will quickly be sentenced, this is what these researchers are saying is more of a deterrent than a long sentence. I can continue. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association. There's an article here which I found quite interesting because it was responding to a similar situation in Canada where the authorities were talking about getting tough on crime by imposing harsher sentences. And criminologists, sociologists, and lawyers wrote to say that decades of research from Canada and comparable jurisdictions such as the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and Australia has shown that longer prison sentences do not reduce crime. It goes on. There's some evidence, again, that the certainty of capture and sanction are what impact behavior. The certainty of capture and sanction, not the length of the sentence. Another one, the effects of imprisonment, specific deterrence and collateral effects. This is by Canadian scholars, once again from the University of Toronto. They note that recidivism rates of those sentenced by tough and lenient judges do not differ. In fact, those who are sentenced by tough judges are more likely to reoffend, So if it is that our aim is to put in place a deterrent, is this an effective deterrent? Is it an effective deterrent? It may be a deterrent, but will it be effective in us achieving the objective that we have set out for ourselves? Will it be effective? And these authors go on to cite other works that indicate similar findings across studies in different parts of the world, in different cities, across different types of populations. They have found consistently that longer sentences do not function as deterrents to offending or reoffending. And what I found interesting about this article is that they further note the collateral impacts of long prison sentences on the families of those imprisoned. In particular, one of the things we are concerned about, that the sons of men who are incarcerated for long periods of time are more likely to commit criminal offenses. And then they go on to talk about the mental health consequences on the families and so on. All of this I'm saying, yes, I know people are going to say, oh, I want to be soft on crime. I want to go and hug up the criminals. I am liberal, soft. This is oppositional kind of talk and what have you. Okay, I can accept some of that, not the oppositional part, not even the soft part. I just want us to focus on what the evidence tells us about this. So while I do not oppose this legislation, I continue to question how effective this will be in dealing with the problem that we have. Does sentencing a 20-year-old to imprisonment until he is 40 lead to his rehabilitation? Will it stop this person from coming out when they're 40 and offending again? Will it? Because if it doesn't, we still have to do some more work beyond this legislation. Will sentencing that person until they are 40 lead to a safer society? If there are other things that are more motivational for persons to commit crimes with a firearm than the threat of 10, 20, or life potentially in prison, then these are the things that I think we really have to focus our efforts on. Does this cautionary tale of someone who went to prison when they were 20 and had to stay until they were 40 truly serve the purpose of deterring those who are young, these fresh-faced boys that we see in the paper, and go about committing these crimes? Does seeing that somebody who you know that was 20 went to jail until they were 40, does that deter you? What is it that is driving people, young people, to do these things? And I am not convinced that this legislation is going to be effective in getting the result that we require. Because some of these persons, and this is a minority in our society, who are intent on committing these kinds of crimes are not focusing on the future consequences. They're living in now. They're living in right now. So the other things that Senator Cummings spoke about, education, social reform, dealing with poverty, fixing the things that we need to fix in our society. These are the areas that, in my estimation, Mr. President, are more critical than the amendments in this legislation. I can take the amendments for what they are. They are a response to a critical situation. People want to see that something is being done and we are doing something. But I wonder if these additional years that we take off of the productive lives of men, predominantly in our society, are actually going to be helpful in allowing us to deal with this issue. Are we saying that there is no way back? And these are violent crimes, these are scary crimes. But are we saying that there is no way back for someone who at 18 years old, 21 years old, 23 years old has committed a gun crime? I hope that there is a way back for such people. And these longer sentences may make it less possible for them to re-enter society and be productive members. So I don't want to discard violence. I'm not tolerating. Let me just make that clear. I'm not saying that I accept gun crime. But there may be ways back for some of these people. And if the evidence that I have read, and I'm not a criminologist, is correct, it does indicate that the longer such persons remain imprisoned, the more likely they may be to reoffend, not less likely. And with that, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Heinz. Senator Dr. Bradford.
Good morning, fellow senators. Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to say a few words on this important piece of legislation that has been presented to this honorable chamber today. I rise to support the legislation, which has been presented because I believe that it's important that we revise from time to time the legal framework which we use to bring about order and appropriate actions in our society to deal with changing circumstances. And as circumstances change, it's important that we modify, adjust our legislation to suit. I support the proposals, in spite of the comments of my fellow senator. I support the proposals. In doing so, however, I am aware that the approval of this bill will not, by itself, solve the problems of crime in our society. It is generally agreed that crime has a significant negative impact on national development and endangers the quality of life of our people. Over the years, several reports have been written on the impact of crime on Caribbean development generally. They show that increasing levels of criminality have eroded confidence among investors, have reduced international competitiveness by introducing much higher costs in the form of additional security and other transactional costs. Not only does crime cause human suffering, but as these reports demonstrate, it can cause capital flight, the loss of those with skills and education who prefer to live elsewhere in a more certain environment, and changes for the worse in the perception of a national investment climate. Moreover, studies by the Inter-American Development Bank and the University of West Indies and others show that crime also is having a negative impact on social development by diverting limited resources away from health and education to security, the control of crime, and the provision of facilities necessary for the administration of justice. I remember a prime minister of a Caribbean country presenting his budget a couple of years ago indicated that for the first time, the budgetary provisions for crime were more than the budgetary provisions for education and health. And it was the first time in the history of that country that that was happening. In other words, over the years, he was seeing an increase in the budgetary provisions for crime in relation to the budgetary provisions for health and education. A tendency such as that, Mr. President, represents, in my view, a backward step, where we are investing more in the control of crime than in health and education. Mr. President, at this critical stage of our development, when we seek to reverse and to recover from the ravages of the pandemic, when we seek to come to terms with the challenges presented by the war between Russia and Ukraine, and other challenges, such as the increasing cost of living and the epidemic of chronic non-communicable diseases, we cannot afford the increasing costs, the increasing financial costs of controlling crime. In addition, we cannot afford the economic and social costs of having the young men of our country dead or spending their most productive years in jail, where they must be housed and fed at our costs, at the cost of the rest of us. There's need, clearly, for jobs. There's need for employment, and there's need for opportunities for the youth of our society. I'm aware that there are no easy answers, but I'm also aware that there are some countries who have been successful in reducing crime levels, and we must learn from their experiences. We must develop a comprehensive approach that involves the entire Barbadian society, which has as its fundamental goal the building of trust between the police service and the communities across our country that they serve. There should be a crime prevention officer in each community of our country, and the neighbors of every community must join together to keep watch over each other's property and must report any suspicious activity to the crime prevention officer. The crime prevention officer should form an intelligence network, linked, of course, to the Central Police Service, to react, to consider, to evaluate the incidents of crime and to take appropriate measures. The new technologies of surveillance systems must be more widely used, and a spirit of community must be promoted once more in our country, where neighbors get to know each other in order to help the police in their efforts to detect and prevent crime. But, Mr. President, we must also recognize that there's an important international dimension to crime, which we must face. We must engage the international communities that have to do with crime. Institutions like Interpol. But it's clear to me that our problems are not necessarily national. They have international linkages. And I say this in the context of an experience. When I was in China, I remember receiving a report of a dangerous drug that was solicited or requested to be sent from that country to Barbados by a Barbadian importer. We received the information at the embassy in Beijing. And I informed immediately our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I assume that appropriate action was taken. I say this to say that there's an international dimension to crime that we must be aware of. And therefore, our embassies and our consulates abroad are also part of the solution which we seek. We are not producers of guns, but we're susceptible to those who produce guns and seek to introduce them into our society. Not so long ago, there was a proposal by someone seeking to produce guns in the Caribbean. Just to give an idea of the international dimension of our problem. And therefore, we have to be alert to global tendencies, global realities, and global crime. Global institutions that treat with crime are therefore important allies for us. And we must work with them to keep our country safe. The regional dimension is also important, as we're fully aware that there are countries very close to us who are involved not only in the production of guns, but in the production of drugs. Therefore, awareness, vigilance, and the importance of international intelligence is critical in our fight against crime in our country. Mr. President, we are at a very important juncture where we must nip these problems in the bud today. Otherwise, they're going to come back to haunt us tomorrow. Mr. President, in order to make Barbados safe again, we must become our brother's keeper once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator Dr. Malvernict.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me as I rise to give my full support to this bill. I believe that there is an acknowledgement that this bill is but one plank in the fight that the government is undertaking to address the issues that we are facing as a country in the context of the increase in gun violence. Mr. President, I think that the leader of government business has fully articulated that the intent is to have a whole of government approach that is buttressed not only in the context of the criminal justice approach to this issue, but that we will have an approach that brings to bear all of the other institutions that are going to be important in order to ensure that we address this in a holistic way. I want to add, Mr. President, that the government is also as well, even in the context of looking at the issue of the criminal justice system and policing, moving to ensure that we can have the Barbados Police Force fully equipped, fully manned, to ensure that they can take on this challenge. We would have heard, Mr. President, that the government will be moving to ensure in the short term that the vacancies within the police force are being addressed. We would have heard, Mr. President, that we will be adding 3 additional criminal courts to the 5 to ensure that there is the certainty and swiftness of justice that is needed. We would have also noted, Mr. President, that just this year, the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Community Development launched a program in which 47 inmates will be able to undertake vocational and as well other training in a variety of areas through the Samuel Jackman Prescott Polytechnic. So that there is an awareness, I believe, that while the amendments, and particularly the amendments that are intended to signal to those criminal elements who are operating with a lack of empathy, who are operating as if there are no consequences for their behavior, that this government and that this society will react swiftly. I think, Mr. President, that there is consensus that is what the government is intended to do. I also want to join with the leader of government business, again, and her assertion that the government is intended to take a whole of government approach, and that the appointment of the Minister of State in the Attorney General's office is evidence that the government is also further aware of the need to make sure that we tighten how we ensure that our ministries collaborate in order to deliver solutions over the long term. Transformation, Mr. President, is just that, long term. And that we ought not to fix our eyes on short-term solutions to this problem, but that we recognize that attempting to fix this, attempting to address this issue is one that will happen over time. And that even as we use the long arm of the law, in some respects, to send a clear message that really the approach has to be more nuanced. It has to be more nuanced, Mr. President, because the issues are complex. November 1st, Mr. President, I attended the lighting ceremony that was held under the aegis of the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Community Development, not too far from here in Hero Square. And at that time, the minister with responsibility for that ministry, the Honourable Charles Griffith, said something that has remained with me. He said in the context of that lighting ceremony that we should, all of us that were listening to him there, should shed a light on our humanity. That for me was a very profound statement, and perhaps lost in the context of the celebratory mood. But it stayed with me because in the Honourable Charles Griffith reminding us, encouraging us, challenging us to shed our light on our humanity, he was reminding us that we are not only humans just in our physical body, but that our humanity speaks to how we treat to one another. Our humanity speaks to the extent that we remember that even though we are individuals, that we live in a society together, and it's the whole of what we do and how we treat to each other that speaks to the nature of our humanity. He was reminding us of the importance of being our brother's keepers and of us taking equal responsibility for the society that we have. And, Mr. President, it was a moment of deep reflection for me. And I would suggest, Mr. President, that this moment, this challenge that we are facing as a society is not only one in which we are filled with angst and concern, but that perhaps it can engender in all of us a moment of reflection. And in doing that reflection, Mr. President, I turned to the one place that for me holds the multiplicity of answers to a lot of the challenges that I face as an individual, and I believe that we all face as a society, and that's the Bible. And as I looked through and was reading and studying and this notion of our humanity and the fundamental things that make up this notion of our humanity, I came across Proverbs 22:6. And Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way that he shall go, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it." And as I contemplated that notion of shedding a light on our humanity in this verse, it made me realize, Mr. President, that as much as a society that we call on government to do what it must and to respond in the way that it must, that we must reflect on the extent to which each of us, as we have become so concerned just only with the things that are within the confines of our curtilage, the extent to which we have become consumed as individuals in self-optimizing, that we have become so desensitized to each other that we can use social media in ways that vilify, pull down, without any kind of reflection of what we say and what we put out will do to the other person. That we have forgotten that notion of humanity. And importantly, perhaps we've forgotten that notion of our responsibility as citizens for the actions that happen within our household and our responsibility for what happens within the wider society. And Mr. President, I hope that I've made it clear at the outset that I'm not saying that government should not respond, that government does not have to play a role. What I am saying, Mr. President, is that we also, in the context of us as individuals, must also reflect on that notion of train up a child. That we must ask ourselves as a society, what is it that we are doing within our households? Who are we producing when we could have young men with an absolute lack of care for anyone in public spaces, almost without fear, attempting to gun down, shoot, kill, maim. It almost makes us not recognize the Barbados that we live in. But these young men, because invariably they are young men, have not sprouted from the sky. They've not been dropped down here by a helicopter. These young men are products of our society. They're products of our households. They're products of our school system. These young men belong to us. They belong to mothers. They are brothers and uncles that are born within the context of our communities. Mr. President, train up the child. What is it that we are imparting? How have we as a society gone so far in terms of the values and mores that we are or should be imparting, that we are now producing this generation? And this is not a problem that legislation will fix. It is not a problem, Mr. President, that prison terms will fix. It is not a problem that the police can fix, because it's the problem that we all must have shared responsibility for. Mr. President, as a child, there were certain things that were ingrained in me that have stayed. I, even as an adult, in adult conversation, will often find myself saying, yes, please. Because I grew up as a child having to say yes, please, as a mark of respect. Good morning, and thank you. And those fundamental things have remained and are ingrained with me because they were taught. But they were not only taught, they were reinforced from my household to the school, within the community, etc. But I was also as well schooled to have empathy, to understand the basics of what kindness means. And I'm saying, Mr. President, that somewhere along the line, as a society, not a government, we have lost that. And the products of that is what we are seeing now. We have, Mr. President, not picked up on the pinpoints that have been evidencing themselves for some time. Because as we are wont as a society, as people, and I include myself, we come to the point of realization only when the thing escalates and jumps out. If you would recall, Mr. President, over, I think it was 5-6 years ago, we had throughout our schools in Barbados cause to be concerned about bullying. There were several schools in Barbados in which this became a concern, and we had a number of anti-bullying campaigns, etc., that were happening. Children bullying one another, children exercising coercive power, children seeking to demean, children lacking empathy. A pinpoint, Mr. President, for future. And the extent to which we as a society fail to recognize that that was not just just about what was happening in the context of a school environment in a moment. But those incidences would then project themselves onto future was a failure of all of us. So that the remedies implemented in the context of seeking to address bullying needed also as well to understand what that would mean in the long term. Those are pinpoints, Mr. President. I grew up, Mr. President, in a neighborhood, as many of us probably have, poor, impoverished. So I grew up near a block, so I know what it is to see men at that time we would call borough house with guns and, regular part. And while we have quite a bit of angst in this society now because it has moved out of certain communities and come to the fore and everybody is up in arms, there are some communities in which we have lived with violence and guns, a pinpoint, Mr. President. If you would recall, there are some communities like Pinelands and New Orleans where we had an outbreak of violence. And it comforted some of us to be able to say it was them. And they are the problem. And if we could deal with them and those particular communities, then it will not touch us as a society. So we were comforted by being able to cast judgment. Those societies and those parents and those children and those communities have got it wrong. It is because they're not doing this and not doing that and not taking care and not instilling. And we were comforted because some of us feel that our position, our money, the security cameras that we have around our house, the dogs, etc., will allow us to have some distance from what is happening within our society. And that we can continue to point fingers and create judgments, even about the young men who perpetuate and their families and what they did and did not do. Because we feel that we are somehow either better off and that it will not touch us. But once you live in this society, then it touches you. Because as was said before, the consequences of crime, the consequences of violent crime and gun violence touches every one of us. Touches every one of us. The feeling of insecurity, Mr. President, is a real threat. There was a study that was carried out by, I believe it was by the UN in 2013, 2014, which looked at insecurity in the region. And it found that insecurity, because of violence within the region, was a major push factor for young people and others. So we are losing people within our society, again, because they feel insecure. Businesses will feel insecure because of the temperature. Mr. President, the evidence also suggests, and I recall, and we've discussed, the Honourable Dr. Charleston Bradford spoke about the cost of the socio-economic cost of crime and violence. There are some studies to suggest, for instance, that crime and violence costs the United States, for instance, annually $557 billion. There's another study, Mr. President, that indicates that for Latin America and the Caribbean, that crime and gun violence specifically costs us 3.5% of our GDP, which is still a lot, Mr. President. Other studies as well also indicate that the violence that is perpetrated has such long-term impacts on the society, socio and socioeconomically, but also for the victims over time. The victims over time. I believe it was the leader of government business who talked about the fact that the sons and daughters and children of those young men who then become incarcerated carry on a legacy of that, Mr. President, train up the child. Train up the child in the way that he shall go, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it. It is wisdom of the ages that is found, and even if you don't read the Bible or are not a Christian, there is sufficient evidence, Mr. President, that suggests, to suggest that that is wise and practical wisdom for living, which is what Proverbs is. Train up the child, Mr. President. And I ask again that we reflect, because very often we also don't recognize that we are contributing as well to what we are seeing in our society just by the way, and I go back to shed a light on our humanity, in our interactions with others. What happens in the workplace when we disenfranchise workers and don't treat them fairly? What are we creating? When we scorn and when we, again, point fingers at those within communities that we believe are lesser than us, what is it, Mr. President, that we are creating? When we don't open up fair employment opportunities for young men and young women, what is it that we are creating? What is it that we are telling these communities and these people about themselves and the value that we as a society place on them? Mr. President, the notion of policing and having measures that do not take on, and I go from not only whole of government, but whole of society approaches, are actually outdated. So the evidence is suggesting that more comprehensive approaches now are following what is called a public health model. And what is a public health model to gun crime? So what we are saying, or what the literature is saying rather, is that we take the notion from public health that when you are dealing with a pandemic or severe illness, that you go to the root cause or the drivers of that behavior and introduce measures in order to be able to change and adapt behavior at the root cause over the long term using science and measuring. So that current strategies, Mr. President, to gun crime and arresting gun crime are using what is called a public health approach. And I want, Mr. President, just to provide 3 or so case studies on how this notion is being used. There was actually a study that was done, and it was done by UN Habitat. And that study referenced again that these approaches are outdated and that we needed to have comprehensive, contemporary approaches based on, and I want to quote Mr. President, enhancement of urban safety and security through urban planning, design, and governance, the development of community-based approaches to enhancing safety and security, reduction of the risk factors by focusing on groups most vulnerable to crime, and strengthening of social capital through initiatives that seek to develop the ability of individuals and communities, Mr. President. And that approach, Mr. President, is evidenced by how modern day approaches. And I want to go to New York. So in New York, and New York again is one of those countries, I believe that we know, Mr. President, that has a heightened level of violence and gun violence. And in New York, they developed a strategy called GIVE, and it was implemented in 17 counties with the highest rates of gun-involved crime. The GIVE means Gun Involved Violence Eliminating Initiative, GIVE. And what stood out for me is that the E, Gun Involved Violence Eliminating Initiative. And the strategy used for E is actually engagement. And it is engagement of the community. And some would say, well, that's what you do in community policing. No, Mr. President, it goes further. What they have done in the context of this program is also to implement a street outreach program, which works with agencies in those areas that are identified as most at risk to be able to deliver services, empower communities, and have communities also as well indicate what they would like to do in the context of helping to solve crime, and for the communities themselves to be able to express a zero tolerance to crime. It's a shift in how we think, Mr. President. I also as well looked at Jamaica. Jamaica is home to all of us, and in the region, and again, high crime. Jamaica has the highest homicide rate in the region, is ranked number 6 in the world for homicides, I think 100,000 per population. Jamaica has started this year a pilot project. And that pilot project, Mr. President, is called Salient. And the project is intended to address the root causes, to reduce violence, not in prisons, Mr. President, not in prisons when they are found, but in schools, through reform measures intended to work on behavior modification programs. So we're addressing the root cause. A similar program, Mr. President, exists in Brooklyn. A similar program exists in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. So that in Brooklyn, we saw a surge in the early months of the pandemic, and I'm talking about recent statistics, and it continued throughout 2021. However, through the interventions using this public health approach, violence fell in Brooklyn in 2021 with a significant decline in both shootings and homicides. It has continued this year, 2022. Shootings are down roughly 20% compared with 7% across other boroughs. The focus on this program is on the drivers, rebuilding trust in communities and addressing the issues of poverty and families and working with key persons within communities. It's a whole of society approach, Mr. President. It's a whole of society approach. You will see a similar program again, Mr. President, in Australia. And they have developed a 4-pronged strategy, but all of it going back to the societies and bringing societies and communities in partnership. One, to develop their own strategies, to develop their own set of recommendations, but also to respond to the needs of those communities, Mr. President. The other example, Mr. President, that I found was that there was a 3-part study that was done. And again, looking at the US and particularly looking at New York. And what that 3-part investigation done was that we had case studies in which incarceration and high deterrent methods of using legislation for as a deterrent was actually the last resort. And that study showed, again, that the method that worked effectively was society coming, communities coming together to, again, address some of the inbuilt issues that these communities were facing in order to reduce the risk factors. So, Mr. President, as I close, I want to go back where it started, shedding a light on our humanity, training up that child in the way that they will not depart from it. And that notion, Mr. President, of shedding a light on our humanity, brings us into shared responsibility for this society that we all love and that we all live in. It should move us from just the starting point of where the state has to, where the state must have harsher, must have more, to recognize that that is only one plank and only one pillar in this fight. But as we shed a light on our humanity, it should allow us to be able to recognize that as individuals, in the way that we interact, in the things that we do when we come into connect with our fellow man, that is also a critical pillar. And as we reflect on that notion of train up that child, our children, that we go back to basics and fundamentals, Mr. President, of who we are as a society, and that we take a hard look at the values and mores that we are passing on, that we take a hard look at how we are raising our children, that we take a hard look at what it is that we are saying, what it is that we are imparting. They should not depart from it if we impart the right thing. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight. Senator Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, when I came to the chamber this morning and I saw the vacant seat, I was a bit disappointed because I had planned to welcome a new minister from the floor, so I'll delay that. Mr. President, I broadly support this bill, but a number of things that I wish to comment on. Mr. President, this amendment of the Firearms Act, Cap 179, has been 24 years in coming. It might sound crazy to say that. For 24 years, this is the first time there has been any action given to all the talk. Any real action given to the talk. So I commend the government for taking this first step to amend an act that needs a thorough revision. Mr. President, the recent increase in violent gun crime and homicides inflicts tremendous trauma on society, not only on the victims and the families, but also on the workers. And we are not in a war zone, but there are times when I believe that we probably are. And I don't know if enough attention is truly being paid to those who are traumatized in the professional capacity. But I'll move on, Mr. President. Mr. President, I speak not as a social worker or as a lawyer or as a criminologist, but as a citizen. And I do not speak as an outsider looking in, but as an insider looking out. I never believed 35 years ago that I would have had a chance to stand here and speak on a Firearms Amendment. And I am glad that I didn't then. And time and maturity has brought temperance to my tongue. So I will be careful about what I say. Mr. President, the act that existed prior to 1998 clearly was altered and amended for a reason, or for many reasons. But there were flaws in some of the amendments and omissions. And we have a major part of this amendment dealing with licensing that in fact is a correction of one of the errors made when that act was repealed and replaced. There used to be licensing of firearms under two categories. One for what could be called personal protection, and the other one for sporting. And these licenses were differentiated on the basis of the fee. For the first one, you paid $75, and the second one, you paid $50. So all sporting licenses, whether it was for hunting or target shooting or whatever, you paid $50. So we have now a change back to the same policy with some differentiation. Now, I listened to, and it meant, therefore, that when the new act came into place, there was only one category of firearm in this country. There was no longer sporting or shooting. And that still exists today. And it will exist until this act is amended, passed, and proclaimed. Now, for the last 24 years, sport shooters in the country have faced severe problems because of the amendment. And it has caused lots of issues that this amendment will now resolve. But it is not retroactive. It draws a line, as far as I can tell, and I wish to be corrected if I'm wrong, it draws a line in the sand, and it says, going forward, this is what we will do. To my understanding, it doesn't apply to what exists today. It says, as of the day when it's proclaimed, this is what will happen. And I beg to be corrected genuinely if I am wrong. Mr. President, those who are responsible for enforcing the law have to follow the law. And it is unreasonable that if the law has changed, that those in charge of it should not follow it. Now, there was a challenge to what was being done, and it was heard in the Supreme Court, and an oral verdict was given on the side of the claimant. But to date, the court's decision has not been enforced. And I hope that this amendment will resolve that issue in a fair way. Sport shooting in this country, Mr. President, has had Barbadians representing the country at a high level, at the Commonwealth Games, at the CSC Games, and at the Olympics. And it's one of the areas that brings in some level of tourism revenue, and it's one of the organizations where there's not much dependence on the government for support. In fact, most of the shooting organizations are quite liquid. Now, I listened, Mr. President, during a break from my normal duties on Tuesdays to the Minister of Home Affairs and Information when he spoke on this amendment in the other place. And he spoke about the different categories of licensing and licenses to be issued. And there are three: personal protection, hunting, and sporting. I will speak a little bit about hunting license, Mr. President. Now, the Minister of Home Affairs and Information spoke about hunting and the necessary and important need to cull the African green monkey. It is truly a pest, and it has caused and continues to cause a large amount of agricultural damage. But we have also invaded its habitat. Places where there are canes and bush and no houses. and the monkeys have to live someplace. And if they can find food in your backyard or in your field, they'll do it. But there's a need to cull the monkeys, but it has to be done safely, humanely, and within the law. But there's a bigger aspect to hunting, Mr. President. And what I'm going to say here today will anger some, but I speak freely. If you fly over Barbados, either with a drone or an aircraft, you will see bodies of water. Some are natural, and some are man-made. There are no less man-made bodies hunting swamps than there used to be. There used to be about 12. As a boy, I lived near one. And you awaken early in the morning to the sounds of shotguns being fired to shoot birds. So the volume of total number of swamps, shooting swamps, have diminished by over 50%. Now, shorebird shooting is a sport. But interestingly, we are one of the last places in the English-speaking Caribbean that still does shorebird shooting. These are migratory birds. They are endangered species, and the shooting of shorebirds has been banned in North America since 1918, over 100 years ago. But little Barbados continues to do it. 300 years of tradition. Tradition is important, but you have to change, Mr. President, because the world has changed. Now, the bodies that control shooting in these swamps have on their own done really good work by not waiting to be told what they can do and to shut them down. They've taken actions to reduce limits of what they can shoot, and they've set gentlemen's agreements of what will be shot each day in the swamp as a maximum. But they've not only done it on a local basis, they've done it in conjunction with some major conservation groups in North America, USA and Canada. And if you check on the internet, there are wonderful write-ups of Barbados and what they've achieved. Interestingly, in all these swamps, tallies are kept about what is shot, how many, what species, and they provide a tremendous repository of information for conservation because they tell about how many birds are being taken. You can cross-reference them with the numbers that currently exist. And sadly, they tell about extinctions too. Because when you stop shooting them, or you shoot birds, you never see them anymore, you can almost tell that they've now gone extinct. And there's some you'll never see again. But they shared all this information to their credit. And they've come up with sensible limits about what birds can be taken and how many for a season and for a day. But we have to ask, is it enough? Our Prime Minister just returned, or I presume she returned, from COP27 as a champion of conservation. Gave nothing less than a brilliant speech that the world has taken on. We cannot, on one hand, stand up and have our Prime Minister represent the world as a beacon of conservation and continue to some of the things that we're doing without regulation. Yesterday, in the other place, Minister Ford gave an extensive discussion about conservation. It was so long and exciting that I delayed my work listening to him. I felt that an edited version should be played in all the schools. It was so good. If we will stand in our parliament and do that and speak on the international stage as we do, we have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Mr. President, I am not suggesting that we should in any way ban shooting in the swamps, because the swamps provide really, really important natural habitat. And the birds that are shot in the swamps come here usually because of the bad weather. And anybody with any common sense will not try to shoot birds in January because the birds have already migrated. You will shoot between July and November when they are migrating. And that's with hurricane season. So when there is a bad hurricane season, there are more birds. So there needs to be some enforcement as to bag limits and make sure we don't exceed them. So they have to be set and agreed to in a sensible way and make sure we don't exceed them. I'm not suggesting that we stop it, because if the persons who invest in the swamps do not invest in the man-made swamps, they'll dry up. And the birds that come off course might not survive. So we do play an important role for the birds that come off course. Yes, we take some, but not all. Now, Mr. President, the changing world demands that we change. And there's this alternative called bird watching that has really, really taken off. And I mean truly avian bird watching, Mr. President. I do mean that. No. Avian watching, Mr. President. I saw the smiles. Barbados offers this unique opportunity, Mr. President, where these thousands of birds that are scattered all over North America in small numbers come together and fly here sometimes. And it's a rare opportunity to see these rare birds that are endangered and in diminishing numbers in such numbers. And maybe there is a place for bird watching and further protection of the shorebirds. I wish, Mr. President, to make a couple suggestions about some of the things that we could probably do, because unfortunately, and my former colleague in the Senate, Senator Franklin, of the time, used to comment that how sad it was that the regulations often did not come to the Senate with the bills. And while this bill has a few good things in it, the real meat of the matter that has to be fleshed out is not here because there are no regulations. And a lot of the things that have to be addressed, Mr. President, have to be addressed in the regulations, which will not come back to the chamber. Decisions will be made on the regulations by the minister and those invited, and who knows what they will contain. But I would like to make a couple of suggestions. With regard to the shorebird shooting, Mr. President, I am aware that as a boy, I saw some people who used to be able to call birds with whistles with unbelievable accuracy. But a whistle only travels so far. And more recent times, people have been using loudspeakers that blast sound up into the atmosphere, and the birds cannot refuse it. Electronic calling. We need to ban it. It needs to be banned, Mr. President. If you're going to be a sportsman, be a sportsman. No electronic devices. And, Mr. President, one of the safest ways to regulate numbers is to restrict killing. Say, fine, you cannot have more than a certain amount of ammunition in a season. And I said I speak from the inside, so I know how some people feel, but I speak from the inside. If you only have X number of rounds, you cannot shoot 5X. And we also need to restrict the magazine capacity of the shotguns used. In other countries, in some places, you're allowed 2 rounds, a double-barrel shotgun. And there's no reason why persons should be shooting in a swamp, shooting endangered species with a magazine capacity that has 10 rounds. It should be outlawed. But that has to come in regulations. And I hope some people are listening, Mr. President. But Mr. President, there's some persons who, for a long time, participated in shorebird shooting and killed a lot of birds. And what is remarkable is that one of the most touching things is if you drive the Congo Road, you will see a swamp with a hut, but not a bird is shot in that swamp. It's a conservatory, it's a sanctuary. And that used to be a major killing field for birds. So it says people can change. And the hunts in Congo Road have done that. It is not impossible. Maybe it needs funding. Maybe there needs to be money provided to help to pump the water and keep the ponds in the right condition for the birds. And maybe if the Parliament can pass legislation to do a debt swap for environmental, and the savings go towards environmental work, this could be seen as something similar with the tourism aspect, Mr. President. Someone can flesh out the great details. Mr. President, on the matter of sport shooting though, I wish to say something. And it's a quote from Abraham Lincoln that I'm sure came from the Bible. I can't quote right from the Bible. Somebody among us will tell us. And it said, "A house divided cannot stand." If all of the shooting organizations cannot stand together, we are like a house divided, and we will not stand. And what has happened in other countries will happen here. So the only way to get to do what you want is to sit with the people in charge and negotiate a reasonable position that you can maintain. And remember that a house divided will not stand. So you cannot have one set of people fighting for themselves and another set fighting for themselves. They all have to fight together. Now, generally, Mr. President, we focus on firearm crime. And there's not a lot of focus on ammunition. And we talk about the number of guns. But guns without ammunition are hammers. Yes, a gun without ammunition is just a hammer. You can beat nails with it. There needs to be a focus on ammunition. So if someone with an unlicensed firearm has a firearm and no ammunition, it's useless to him. Maybe the focus needs to switch somewhat further onto the ammunition and have similar penalties for ammunition. But when people turn in firearms in amnesties that most people say nowadays don't really work, or they claim don't work, the people who would probably turn in their firearms are afraid to because they think if it was used in a crime before they had it, they will have to take the blame. But live ammunition could not have committed a crime. You could not have injured someone with live ammunition. So there should be a continuous amnesty on ammunition. I would like to suggest that they have drop boxes, just as you have in an ATM. An old granny can take up somebody's ammunition from the house and take it and drop it in the drop box. She doesn't have to answer anything because there's no crime. It couldn't have been used. The ones that she dropped in or dropped in could not be used for crime. In the matter of amnesties, Mr. President, there are places where sums of money have been offered to buy back firearms, both legal firearms and illegal firearms. And Barbados signed on to a convention, I think it's a UN convention, to deal with the reduction in firearms in the country. And the Barbados Police Service have been doing an excellent job with destruction. And it has prevented, and mind you, I don't have any evidence that there was leaching, but it is meant to prevent leaching from armories. I have no evidence that there is leaching. But because of the strict way that it is run by some well-selected, trustworthy people with full documentation, they have done an excellent job in destroying the guns that are recovered, that were used in crime, the ones that are turned in where the owners have passed, and even firearms now obsolete from the military. And they must be commended because it reduces the number of guns in the society and the possible numbers that can leach if such a thing happens. They have taken a similar approach to ammunition, but I would like to encourage them to have a constant year-round, daily amnesty on turning in ammunition, because guns without ammunition, Mr. President, are hammers. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Mr. Leonard. Senator Paris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to support the bill before this honorable chamber. Within the last couple of months, our country has been experiencing a spate of gun-related crime, which, if not stopped or curbed, has the tendency to disrupt our peaceful way of life. Mr. President, this government intends to do whatever is possible under the laws of this country to disrupt such unwanted circumstances. Indeed, since we came to office in 2018, we have done many things, many of which have been well documented, and we will continue to do more. That's why we are here today having this debate. Mr. President, I would like to remind this chamber that as a government, we have given the premier law enforcement agency, the police, all that they have requested in order to get their job done. Mr. President, we have increased the number of judges to erase the backlog of criminal cases. We have increased the number of prosecutors in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution. Mr. President, it is clear that this government listens to the people. We listened when we were in opposition, and we continue to listen as a government. We recognize that there are some omissions and areas that need to be dealt with. One such is the amendments to the Firearms Bill, which would allow us to address some of the omissions. And again, I say that is why we are here today. When I reflect on the number of telephone calls that I have been receiving in the past months with respect to gun crimes, the frustration and the fear expressed by citizens in this still peaceful country, I was really, and I am really moved. I am moved to see the tears of families who have lost their loved ones. Mr. President, as I read the amendments to this bill, I was moved as well. But I dare say I was moved in a really different way. I saw these amendments as an effort being made to tighten the legislation and bring an end to the gun violence. I am pleased that the framers of these amendments did their research and recognized that Barbados is not the only country that is experiencing difficulties with persons bent on disrupting civil obedience. Some of the jurisdictions like Turks and Caicos and the UK enact legislation similar to what we are doing today. From all accounts, the amendments have achieved some of the desired results. I would be the first person, Mr. President, to say that nothing is foolproof. But having assessed these amendments, I remain positive as to what these amendments can do. I also believe that they will go a long way in deterring persons from possessing firearms and committing such terrible acts. Mr. President, I really don't have to tell this august chamber the devastating effect that each shooting does on the psyche of our citizens and to the image that is sent overseas of this country, particularly to the countries that contribute significantly to our tourism industry. Mr. President, in these times, we simply cannot afford to allow anything or anyone to put us in a negative light and derail the progress of this nation. We recognize that minimum incarceration legislation might not be the absolute way to go, simply because there may be some instances where some persons might find themselves in rather unfortunate positions, causing them to come into possession of firearms. I have no issues with giving discretionary powers to the judges where this is concerned. Mr. President, I am sure our international partners are asking questions, and plenty of questions, about these gun crimes. And we know what can happen if an advisory is issued saying to persons not to come to Barbados. So, as I have said previously, this amendment will certainly send messages to the offenders as well as the international world, saying that we are doing something to curb the crime. It has been reported that we have had 39 murders for the year so far, 29 of which are as a result of firearms. This nonsense needs to stop. Mr. President, we are all aware that when we have these shootings and persons have to go to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for treatment, that it is creating an unnecessary burden on this institution. It is taxing not only financially, but it is mentally taxing to the nurses and doctors who have to treat these patients. In most instances, the injuries are life-threatening, and it is the cost attached to it. The taxpayers of this country are the persons who have to bear this cost for the treatment of these victims. This is money that can be used in other areas of the hospital. The citizens of this country have had enough of this behavior. And I am appealing to the few persons, because I believe there are a few, they are in the minority, who are responsible for this behavior to stop it. I am saying enough is enough. Mr. President, I have confidence in the men and women of the Barbados Police Service that they will bring the present situation under control. We have had spikes before, and this is exactly what they did. I am calling on the churches, and I know Senator Rogers will join me in this call, and parents to get the children to attend church and Sunday school. As a young person growing up in my community, we look forward to going to church and attending Sunday school every Sunday, rain or sunshine. We were also involved in the church lads and church girls brigade. These activities kept us grounded and focused. I am also asking communities to work with the youth commissioners of the Ministry of Youth, Sports, and Community Empowerment in getting the young people from these communities involved in the programs being offered by this government. These programs are designed to keep them engaged, while at the same time encouraging them to have a positive outlook on life. I'm also appealing to every citizen because it is affecting all of us. Every citizen to give the Barbados Police Service their support so together we can restore peace to this, our fair land. In closing, Mr. President, I once again pledge my support to this bill before this honorable chamber, and I am obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Paris. Senator
Mr. President, thank you. I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Honourable Senate until 3:45 in the afternoon. Until 2:45 in the afternoon.
It's getting moved by your generosity. The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:45 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. The sitting is suspended until 2:45 p.m. today.